Yeah, I mean, I see it, and it's extremely exciting. Among that too has been like I think a renewed interest in unionizing from all sorts of industries. Um, I want to sort of circle back to what you were talking about earlier with like the concept of like a strike wave, right? Which was, to me, it sounded like you're describing, a bit of like class consciousness, right? It's like people sort of seeing in other people in other industries, like, okay, that's us, right? Because I'm very, I don't, God, I don't mean to be such a typical leftist and like see something good and already like looking at, getting worried that something bad's going to happen. But I'm seeing, when you read, Financial Times right now, or a lot of the business press, the big things that people are writing about are, well, right now it's, supply chain stuff, which has also been really interesting too, I think, by the way, because it has really like brought labor back into the public discourse. A lot of people have just sort of expected things to arrive, and seeing that actually requires people to do it has, I think, also been a factor in the kind of militancy. But there's the specter of inflation, right? Which is what everybody is sort of talking about as a reason that we need to sort of buckle down and pull these things back. And I just remember that pretty much every time in the United States, whenever inflation is brought up, that is just a great excuse for the government to pursue policies that are anti-worker, right? And to be able to fight back against that, we are going to need to start to build that kind of conception, right? Because that's always remind people, there's a kind of like consensus among a lot of kind of right-wing economists, which tends to just be the majority in this country, that whenever workers' wages go up a little bit, that means that we have to deal with mass inflation, right? But I remind people that workers aren't the ones who set prices, right? That's the bosses, and that's the owner of these organizations, right? So we have to be able to build up our capacity to be able to, one, like have the argument, but two, to be able to have the strength. And the fight. But I'm curious, like, because you've been talking to people for a while now, working people across the country. I mean, obviously, the COVID pandemic has really shifted the discourse and opportunity. But like, were you seeing any signs before this of a kind of shift amongst the way that like working people were thinking about, I don't know, their jobs and unions, etc., before the pandemic hit, or do you think the pandemic really just opened up a whole new way of thinking?
It's a great question because I don't want to be kind of dishonest there,
Hmm.
because I do think that, something that has come through in, uh, you know, all of the conversations that I've had with workers, for working people, and, I think, almost 4 years now, I've talked to auto workers, I've talked to sex workers, I've talked to teachers, I've talked
Hmm.
to stay-at-home parents, I've talked to, just workers, across, all types of industries doing all sorts of labor. And, I do think that it is very much a common theme if you go listen to the whole back catalog of working people, right? That there is this sort of deep human yearning, right, in people. And I don't think that it's hard to say whether or not that is a product of the time, and whether that is people have been ready for this, or again, if it's just a product of the fact that this is something that all of us deeply have held within us, right? Deep in our kind of souls. Like, we know in our most like human core that we deserve better than this. That is something that I do think a lot of people have been waking up to. And I would say that, like, perhaps in the wake of the Great Recession, that was kind of a
Hmm.
major, blowing open of that sort of mental block before, where, I think it was more common before the recession to sort of have that, kind of mindset, and a mindset I grew up with as a conservative, right? That, like, if you were unhappy, it was probably your fault, right? And you weren't working hard enough, you weren't doing enough, you weren't being enough. If all of those ended up being untrue, then maybe you were getting screwed over. So your job was to leave, right? Your job was to kind of carve a better path, because ultimately you were in charge of your own destiny. I think that that was a much more generalized feeling among workers before the Great Recession. It was also the kind of mentality that the fiction of the economy leading up to the recession encouraged, right? Because people
Hmm.
still felt like they had the sort of, they felt like, a pathway to a comfortable middle or upper middle class kind of existence was still possible. And I do think that more people after the Great Recession kind of came to the conclusion that that was largely an illusion, and that in fact the inordinate wealth of the ruling class was closing off those pathways to the rest of us being able to achieve that sort of American dream that my dad came to this country for, that so many people have spent their lives searching for, right? So it's all is a kind of a I'm taking the scenic route, as I say, to kind of answer your question. But I think that this is all part of how I would answer it, right? I think that after the recession, more and more people had to learn how to feel okay with saying, I'm getting screwed over, right? And it's not my fault. Right.
Hmm.
Another conversation that I have for this book that's coming out is with a brilliant woman worker in Detroit named Courtney Smith, who like talks about the power of, you know, recovering from alcoholism, like having grown up in, you know, like a home that dealt with poverty, that dealt with kind of parents in prison and drug use and stuff like that. She talked about how powerful it was to finally acknowledge that it wasn't all her fault. Like, you know, who she was, how she was living, the pain she was feeling. And I know the very first episode of Working People that I ever did with my dad, Jesus Alvarez, after we had lost our house in the Great Recession, after we had lost everything really,
Hmm.
and we were all punishing ourselves so deeply with that pre-recession mindset, thinking that a global recession was all our fault. Like everything that we lost, we could have kept from losing if we did something different. Right. I feel like there were a few years where that was the case and we were depressed as shit. You know, our family was really breaking apart. And that very first episode of Working People was one of my attempts that my siblings and I, you know, had tried to get our parents to talk about it in, you know, instead of
Hmm.
going to therapy, at least talk to us about it, talk through what's going on in your head, and ultimately come to that conclusion that like, wow, like maybe this wasn't all my fault. And the thing that opened that door up for my dad, and I apologize if I've told this story to anyone who's watching, but you know, he, you know, doesn't go to therapy. This was not the kind of person that he was before the recession. It was not the kind of person he was, you know, in the years after the recession. And no matter how many times his children would kind of tell him that it wasn't his fault, that he should stop punishing himself, the first time that I started to notice that sink in was when he was driving for Uber to kind of pay bills, and he was talking to the people he was driving. And, you know, he was realizing that he was driving people who were his age, who had also lost their home. He was driving other immigrants, you know, who had lost their homes or who had lost their jobs or who were on their way to their second or third job. That was when he started to realize he wasn't alone. And
Hmm.
that's when he started to feel a little more okay sharing what he had gone through. And therein is that kind of generative kind of core of why I felt, you know, like, you know, we've all seen the power of workers kind of talking shop, sharing horror stories over a cigarette and stuff like that. But this was something that kind of really crystallized that in a really powerful therapeutic way
Hmm.
that allowed my dad to confront that trauma in a way that he hadn't yet. And I wanted to help kind of provide a space for that where workers could be open, could talk about their struggles, could feel that their stories were in conversation with, you know, the other stories that had been shared on the show, and kind of make it a sort of virtual break room where we could all be honest about the ways that capitalism was screwing us over. Right. And so circle back to the question. This, I think, has been a process over the past decade of people first realizing that the system and the promise of that system that really kind of coasted us through the Reagan years and the kind of end of the Cold War, right? That belief that American capitalism could really provide for all. I feel like that
Hmm.
it took time for that to run out of steam. Then it took time for us to develop the language about who was at fault here, what the real structural issues were, and also to do that sort of personal reflection to acknowledge that, in fact, we were being wronged, that in order to kind of correct this sort of system, we needed to find one another once again. We needed to build that sort of solidarity. And in a country where the main vehicle for building that solidarity, for addressing those issues, i.e., the labor movement, had been battered so much for so long to the point that we're like at historic low union density.
Mhm.
That's taken a long time, but I think we are now starting to see the fruits of that, and the pandemic did catalyze that process quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean that conversation. I had a similar one with my father. Like, we didn't have nearly the issues with like loss of house or anything like that, but um, still having a conversation in the last like 5 years of like, I'm having to work deep into my 60s, and I thought, like, you can't do it. You can't do what they say you should be able to do in this country. That's
Mhm.
a profound conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's though in those kind of, I mean, that's happening, more and more in like I don't know, like the expectations that our parents had. I think, at least most of them, haven't been met because of the changing dynamics. But I mean, I like to, I think that like talking about these things is really important. One, because I think in your dad's story, like sharing those experiences, can really help deal with some of the guilt and like the psychological like trauma and stuff like that that is sort of thrown at us. But it also gives us like a way out. So I grew up in the South. I grew up poor in the South. I had I was a bit conservative in those days, and I'd worked, all throughout my teenage years, but my first like real kind of, I mean, I shouldn't use the word real, but my adult job was working concrete, right? And I was working concrete as a young guy. I was the only white guy on the job, which was a really amazing experience for other reasons. But I started to realize very quickly, though, it's like, well, I'm getting brought in here because everyone else here has like 10, 12 years experience. And the guy we're working for was a real shit boss. No one else wanted to work for him. So they were trying to get in young people who would accept a lower wage than everybody else. Right. So, I was being brought in to sort of break labor. I had no idea. Right. But anyways, it's like I had been working there for a little bit, and it was our first day, like doing a real big poor job, right? And when you do that, you have to have full equipment, boots, and all that kind of stuff, which I didn't have. I was just wearing typical like work clothes. So boss looks at me, he says, do you have like boots for for pouring concrete? It's like, no. He says, all right. He takes me to Walmart, and he like buys me all the equipment that I need, and he says, I'll take this out of your paycheck. And I came back to the site, and the guys came up to me and they said, hey, David, did you buy those? And I said, no, I didn't. The boss paid for them. He says, did he pay for them? Is he going to take them out of your paycheck? I said, he's going to take them out of my paycheck. And these guys, so it was like a group of 6 folks. It was, like 5 immigrant workers and another like older black South Carolinian man. They walked up to him and they said, we are not going to do this job. And if you're going to charge this kid for his equipment, you don't make me pay for the shovel. You don't make me pay for this. Why are you going to take advantage of this person, right? And they didn't have to do that or anything like that. And I don't tell the story, but like I tell the story because for me, at least, it was a realization that like, oh, these are like my comrades. Like these are my people. Like we're on the same side. And they got that. I didn't get charged for any of that equipment. And I don't know. It's like a really quick lesson in not only like what side are you on, but also when you stick together and we say we're going to withhold our labor, you can get a lot of shit done really quickly. They didn't have to convince him on any kind of moral level. They just said, we're not going to work. And I think that like what I think is encouraging about what we've been seeing over the past 2 months, just talking to people around where I grew up, is that there is becoming more, I think, awareness of what happens when, people don't show up to work. Or say they're going to refuse it. And that's, I think, is the hope that it's going to be able to spread, because I don't know, being able to tell these stories and to make these things seem tangible rather than just sort of like abstract, I think is a really powerful tool in breaking the kind of power capital has over our minds.
I agree. So I wanted to check how much time do we have? Because that
As much as you got.
okay, cool. Because I think it's a it's a powerful story and a really powerful point, right? Because this is something that I've talked about quite a bit on my show, Working People, with other workers, because I think that's another thing to really kind of remember here, right? Not to again, do the leftist poo-pooing sort of thing, but just to kind of make sure that we understand what it is that we're dealing with here. As I was kind of just saying on that kind of long-winded rant, right? The bare fact is that union density in this country is still at like practically an all-time low. right? In the private sector, it's abysmal, right? But I mean, I think we're still hovering just above 10% nationally, right? That is a far cry from, you know, the amount of workers who used to be, or the percentage of workers in the U.S. workforce who used to be part of a union, right? And so for most people, this is something we talked about, you know, during the Bessemer drive, and after the Bessemer drive was defeated, I was like, you know, for most people, the concept of being in a union is entirely theoretical, right?
Hmm.
Because they've either never been in a union job, or, you know, their union jobs, if they actually had one, a lot of people have had bad
Yeah.
experiences, right? And we're kind of seeing a sort of another encouraging thing is we are seeing kind of rank and file energy pushing to revamp the sort of structure of the labor movement so that it is more responsive to the rank and file's needs, and we may actually get a fucking crash course in that in not in 3 hours, when, you know, over 10,000 John Deere workers
I
could
know.
go on strike, right? And even next week, UAW members are going to be voting in a historic referendum about whether or not they can directly elect their top leaders in the union. That's incredible, right? But again, it signals that a lot of people, you know, who may have had union jobs may not have had good experiences with them, and that's something that we need to acknowledge. The hardest, I think, episode of Working People I ever did was one that we published last month, which was I couldn't interview the worker that we were talking about because he committed suicide.
Oh man.
And
Sorry.
because this worker, Evan Seyfried, I was talking to his family. He was in the union, you know, and the union failed him, right? He was getting harassed and bullied by management, but when he tried to get, you know, his union steward to help, the union steward like kind of was friends with management, and they, you know, collaborated on this horrifying sort of campaign to bully and harass this poor guy who had worked there at Kroger for 20 years. He was a loving, caring
Mm.
person, dedicated to his job, and no one was there for him. And he ultimately, you know, his family describes him experiencing a psychotic break and taking his own life. And that, talking to his family about that was really, really hard, but it really showed the consequences of people not having your back at work.
Mhm.
And this is, I think, where I'm getting at, is that most people don't know what that feels like.
Mhm.
Even whether it's in a union shop or a non-union shop, the vast majority of us have only ever known the sort of cutthroat, individualistic, you know, either climbing our way up the ladder or staying out of, you know, the way of the boss in order to kind of get our paycheck and go home.
Mhm.
Right. And so, you know, those experiences when you have your coworkers stand up for you, even if you didn't ask for it, really stay with you clearly. Right. I mean, I've had similar experiences myself where folks kind of stood up for me and pointed out that I was getting screwed over in a way that I didn't even realize at the time. And so, you know, like that is ultimately like what we mean when we talk about the labor movement, when we talk about the importance of unions. It's actually having the experience that has been beaten out of so many of us, which is feeling like we are more than just ourselves at work. We are the kind of workforce, right? There is, you know, think about that
Mhm.
second, you know, word there. You know, we have force in the power of workers working collectively, but you cannot be a workforce as an individual worker, right? You need to
Mhm.
be the force of a collective there. And I feel like, again, to tie it back to the other point that we were talking about earlier, something that we've talked about with a lot of non-union workers on the show is that, like, I feel like for the vast majority of us, those kind of entry level jobs, those non-union jobs, typically, they're almost a type of sinister social engineering where, you know, new workers are educated in the experience of having complete powerlessness in the workplace,
Mhm.
right? It is a form of discipline, is a form of indoctrination, is a form of education where your main sort of the main goal there, right, is to indoctrinate you into accepting that experience of having no power and no say over your working conditions. And so again, I think that this is the point that I wanted to get to. That's why, you know, like, people seeing these worker struggles is so important. People
Mhm.
seeing, you know, like, the rank and file militancy is so important, and we in the media have a role to play there to try to amplify that message, connect people to those struggles that they may not have seen otherwise because corporate media never fucking covers it. But here's the point that I wanted to make. So the brilliant labor organizer and former co-host of the Valley Labor Report, David Story, our beloved comrade from Alabama, made a really important point when we did like this working people live listener hang session, where we had listeners kind of call in so that Jules and I could kind of talk with them and stuff. It was a lot of fun. But we talked about this. We talked about the Great Resignation. We talked about the quote unquote strike wave, what it meant, how much hope we should have for it. And David, as he tends to do, made a very sobering point where he said, look, like, until I see otherwise, I'm going to worry that this is a historic moment where we are seeing historic levels of workers quit, where we are seeing historic levels of people realize in some level that they do deserve better. But in the absence of a strong and organized labor movement, the thing that people do, the one kind of tool that they have been using is leaving. And if you and so we have essentially been given the opportunity to vacate that battlefield instead of dig our heels in and push in our respective workplaces for better conditions for the next people who walk in the door. So that is, again, a sign of the how far we still have to go to turn a moment like this, which may be a once in a generation kind of moment, into what it needs to be.